A father ran toward a stranger, dragging his daughter into the dark, and paid for it with his life. For years, his death was filed away as just another break-in gone wrong, not the opening act of a killer still learning what he was capable of. Over the next several years, that same appetite would return again and again, each time hungrier, until one final night when it simply stopped. Claude Snelling. A man died because he heard his daughter scream and did the one thing every parent tells themselves they would do. He got up and ran toward the danger instead of away from it. Claude Snelling was 45 years old, a journalism professor at the College of the Sequoias, living an ordinary life in Visalia, California. On September 11, 1975, that ordinary life ended in his own backyard. A masked man had broken into his home and grabbed his 16-year-old daughter, dragging her out into the dark. Snelling confronted him. The intruder shot him dead and fled into the night, leaving behind zero explanation and zero name, because at the time, there was no name. Police called him the Visalia Ransacker, a prowler who had already broken into hundreds of homes across the city, rifling through drawers and stealing odd little trophies, never once pulling a trigger. Burglary was his signature. Snelling's murder did not fit the pattern. It broke it completely. Nobody investigating that night understood what they were actually looking at. They thought they had a burglar who panicked. What they actually had was a man discovering in real time that he could kill and keep walking. Decades later, DNA and confession would confirm what detectives never saw coming. Snelling was not just a random casualty of a break-in gone wrong. He was the first blood this offender ever spilled, the opening entry in a body count that would eventually stretch across the entire state. The evidence connecting that night to everything after is strong enough to convict. What is thinner is the why, the exact psychological switch that flipped inside a man who had spent years content with just stealing. A prowler had just crossed a line he could never uncross, but for now he retreated back into the shadows. It would be nearly 3 years before he killed again, and when he did, it would not be a father defending his child. It would be two people who did nothing but take their dog for a walk. Katie Maggiore. A 20-year-old girl took her dog for a walk on a Thursday night and never made it home. That's it, that's the whole setup. No party, no late-night errand, no argument that sent her storming out the door. Katie Maggiore stepped outside for the most forgettable kind of errand a person can run, and it became one of the defining murders in California history. February 2nd, 1978, Rancho Cordova. Katie and her husband were out walking their dog through a quiet suburban neighborhood when they spotted a man who did not belong there, lurking in the kind of way that makes your stomach drop before your brain catches up. They ran. Through backyards, between houses, the exact geography that had let this same man vanish after dozens of home invasions before. This time running wasn't enough. He chased them down and shot them both, multiple times, in the street where they lived. For over a year, the man terrorizing Sacramento had a pattern: break in, rape, disappear. His victims survived. That was the twisted rule of the East Area Rapist, horrifying but not fatal. Katie and her husband broke the rule just by being outside at the wrong moment, and in doing so, they became the first confirmed murders tied to a man who had spent over a year proving he could enter any home in the county undetected. The break-in artist who studied backyards and fence lines had just discovered he could kill in the open, in a chase, in front of witnesses, and get away with it anyway. Investigators would spend decades connecting the dots. D'Angelo was eventually charged with Katie's murder specifically, one piece of a plea deal in June 2020 that bundled together 13 killings into a single guilty plea. Whether the couple recognized him from an earlier close call or simply had the misfortune of crossing his path, one thing isn't up for debate. This was the night the rapist became a killer for good. Katie wasn't walking alone that night. Beside her was a man trained to handle danger, and even he couldn't stop what happened next. Brian Maggiore. A 21-year-old Air Force sergeant trained to handle a weapon and trained to handle fear still could not survive a foot chase down a residential street in Rancho Cordova. That is not a knock on Brian Maggiore. That is what makes his death the scariest data point in the entire case. On February 2nd, 1978, Brian and his wife Katie were walking their dog through their own neighborhood, the kind of errand nobody thinks twice about. Somewhere along that route, a man started following them. What happened next turned into a foot chase through backyards and side streets, ending with shell casings scattered across the pavement, and trajectory evidence showing the shooter fired again and again as the couple tried to run. Stationed at Mather Air Force Base, Brian had training most attackers never planned for. It did not matter. The man chasing him had spent years perfecting something Brian's training never covered: how to move through a dark neighborhood like he owned it, how to plan an exit before anyone knew there was a threat, how to close distance on someone who was actively running for their life. Every break-in before this one had been rehearsal. Brian and Katie just did not know they had wandered into the final exam. Investigators did not see it that way at first. The attack happened outside, in the open, nothing like the East Area Rapist's usual method of slipping into homes while people slept. For a while, detectives floated other explanations, even a personal dispute, because a street shooting did not fit a home invasion pattern. The case sat unresolved, filed separately, nearly lost inside its own contradictions. It took years of DNA work and pattern analysis to confirm what the shell casings had been saying the entire time. Brian and Katie were not a separate crime. They were victim number one, the moment prowling turned into killing. A couple who wanted nothing more than a quiet walk with their dog and paid for it with everything they had left. In Sacramento, the killer stayed outdoors, in chases and open streets. But he was about to move hundreds of miles south, and there he would perfect something far more intimate and far more terrifying. Walking into a home while the people inside slept. Robert Offerman, a man tied up and left for dead, somehow got a hand loose, and it still was not enough to save him. That is the part that makes this scene different from everything that came before it. This was not a chase through a backyard or a struggle in the dark outside a window. This was an attacker who had already won, who had already gotten his victim bound and controlled inside a locked home, and somehow lost the room anyway. Robert Offerman was 44 years old, an orthopedic surgeon living a quiet, successful life in Goleta, up in Santa Barbara County. On December 30th, 1979, he was found dead in a condominium on Avenida Pequena. He had been bound like the others in this series would be, restrained and rendered helpless by a man who had turned home invasion into a rehearsed routine. Except Offerman did not stay helpless. The evidence at the scene showed he had partially freed himself from his bindings and appeared to rush his attacker head-on, a last desperate swing at reversing a situation that should have already been over. It did not work. He was shot. Blunt force trauma was documented alongside the gunshot wounds, overkill stacked on top of overkill, the signature that would follow this killer through every home he entered next. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was a controlled scene that briefly slipped out of control, and the man behind it adapted in real time and finished the job anyway. Some investigators see this as a test run, a new hunter checking whether his methods would hold up outside the territory he already knew. Others see something more deliberate, not an experiment, but the next planned step of a man expanding south with purpose. Nothing in the case file settles it outright, but the pattern that follows suggests this was never improvisation. It was a killer proving his system could survive a mistake. Offerman fought and nearly escaped. The woman found beside him did not, and her murder marked a chilling change. For the first time, the killer's victims were no longer surviving the attack. Deborah Manning. For years, this offender's victims survived him. With Deborah Manning, that stops being true, and it never happens again. She was 35 years old, working in the medical field, spending the evening of December 30th, 1979 with a man named Dr. Robert Offerman in his Goleta condominium. By the time anyone found them, she was bound in bed, raped, and dead. The rape itself was not new. Sacramento had already shown the world what this man did to women he controlled with rope and whispered threats. What was new was the ending. Every earlier attack carried the same blueprint. Restrain the victim, assault her, leave her alive to describe him to police. That pattern had held for over a year and dozens of victims, a horrifying but survivable ritual. Manning breaks it completely. Same ligatures, same method of control, same sexual violence. Except this time, the victim does not go home. She does not testify. She does not get to grow old telling anyone what happened to her. That is the turn. This is not a killer discovering a new fetish or a new target type. This is a rapist discovering that murder costs him nothing and gains him everything, silence chief among it. Investigators and prosecutors have laid it out plainly in the decades since, and D'Angelo himself confirmed it in 2020 when he stood in a courtroom and admitted to killing Deborah Manning as part of his plea. True crime circles still argue about what this actually reveals. Was the sex ever the point? Or was it always about domination, with killing simply the next available lever to pull? By Goleta, some argue there was no separating the two anymore. The rape and the murder had fused into a single act, one signature instead of two. Deborah Manning wanted an ordinary night with a man she was dating. Instead, she became the marker where an assailant who raped and let his victims live turned into something with no exit interviews left to give. The killer had discovered that his victims no longer had to survive, and the next couple wouldn't be shot at all. They would be beaten to death using objects the killer found inside their own home. Charlene Smith. He didn't bring a weapon into that house on High Point Drive, and 2 people died anyway. That's not an accident. That's a graduation. Every early attack in this case involved a gun he carried in with him, a threat he needed to bring from the outside. By March of 1980, he didn't need to bring anything. He could walk into a stranger's home empty-handed and still walk out, having killed twice because the house itself had everything he needed. Charlene Smith was 33, an interior decorator with a life built on making other people's homes feel safe. She and her husband missed church on a Sunday morning, which was apparently unusual enough that someone came looking. What they found inside the house on March 13, 1980 was 2 bodies bound and beaten to death with objects the killer found on site. Cords, blunt items, whatever was sitting in that house waiting to become a murder weapon. Charlene was also sexually assaulted. Time of death was placed roughly a day earlier, meaning the couple had already been dead for hours by the time anyone noticed something was wrong. The bludgeoning is the detail that separates this from almost every case before it. Bindings and improvised weapons meant he no longer needed to plan for lethal force. He just needed access. Once he was inside, the house became the armory. There's a theory that follows the Smiths specifically, because Lyman worked in law and Charlene worked in design, an educated, established couple in a wealthy Ventura neighborhood. Some in the case's community read that pairing as deliberate, a killer targeting successful couples as trophies. The pattern is thin. A handful of victims with impressive careers doesn't prove he was hunting resumes instead of houses, and the more mundane explanation that he was simply working the wealthiest streets he could find fits just as easily. What isn't up for debate is that this murder, along with Lyman's, became one of the cases prosecutors formally tied to Joseph DeAngelo in 2018, and one he ultimately admitted to. Charlene didn't die alone that night. The man beside her had spent his career putting criminals away, and by an ugly twist of fate, he was murdered by one on the verge of becoming something far more powerful. Lyman Smith, a cop killer, just murdered a man one signature away from becoming a judge. That's not a coincidence anyone can shrug off easily. Lyman Smith was 43 years old, a prominent Ventura attorney who used to be a deputy district attorney, and by March of 1980, he was reportedly in line for a seat on the bench. The man who ended his life had spent years wearing a badge himself, 2 different versions of the same system standing on opposite sides of a bedroom, and only one of them walked out. On March 13, 1980, Lyman and his wife Charlene were found dead in their Ventura home. Both killed in bed, no forced entry drama, no struggle down a hallway, just a house the killer had already decided was his before either of them knew he was inside. This time there were no gunshots. Lyman was bludgeoned, close range, hands-on. The Offerman and Manning killings, months earlier, had ended with a firearm. Here the killer chose something slower and more personal, proof that his method wasn't fixed. It was evolving, refining itself with every house he emptied out. Some case followers have run with the idea that Lyman's legal past made him a target on purpose, that a former prosecutor climbing toward a judgeship was too perfect a kill to be random. It's a good story. Nothing in the record backs it up, and there's no documented link between DeAngelo and Smith, no grudge, no case file connecting them, and the far more likely explanation is the boring, brutal one. The house got picked because it was there, because a light was off or a window was unlocked, the same way every other house had been picked before it. That doesn't make the irony disappear, it just means the irony wasn't the point. A man who studied the law for a living never saw the danger walking his own street at night, and DNA sitting untouched for decades would eventually be exactly what tied his death to DeAngelo's confession. The judgeship never happened, the consolidated case did. Every house so far had belonged to people old enough to have built something, a career, a marriage, a name on a door. The next one belonged to 2 people who'd barely had the time, less than a year married, still learning what a shared address even meant, and one of them was about to leave a legacy that had nothing to do with how he died. Keith Harrington. A medical student who never got to practice medicine ended up rewriting the law that would catch his own killer. Keith Eli Harrington was 24 months away from a career healing people when someone broke into his Donna. Point home and beat him to death in his bed. No gun, no struggle downstairs. Just a nighttime bedroom attack on August 19th in 1980 in a house that should have felt safe in one of Orange County's quieter, wealthier corners. That location matters. The killer had spent his early crimes creeping through working-class neighborhoods closer to Sacramento. Now he was hundreds of miles south, picking a home in a nicer county, killing a future doctor in his own bedroom. That is not a man losing his nerve. That is a man who has decided nowhere is off limits. Keith didn't get a trial while he was alive to see it, but decades later, DNA evidence tied his murder directly to Joseph DeAngelo, folded into the original Night Stalker charges he ultimately pleaded guilty to. That part sounds like every other entry in this list. It's the part that comes after where Keith's death stops being just another data point. Keith's brother, Bruce Harrington, could not let the case stay cold. He spent years pushing California lawmakers to expand DNA collection, and that fight became Proposition 69, a law that dramatically widened who got their genetic profile logged into state databases. Supporters point straight at cases like Keith's to justify it. Civil liberties advocates look at the same law and see a warning about how much of your body the state gets to keep on file. Both sides are arguing about the exact same expansion, and it started because one brother refused to let a medical student's murder be forgotten. Here's the part that closes the loop, and it's stranger than the law itself. D'Angelo wasn't caught because his profile sat in the very database Bruce fought to expand. He was caught because investigators went around it entirely, building a family tree on a public genealogy site never designed for manhunts. Bruce's fight reshaped what the state was allowed to collect. It just is not the tool that finally cornered his brother's killer. A grieving brother spent years sharpening one weapon, and history handed the final blow to a completely different one. Keith wasn't attacked alone. Beside him was a woman less than a year into marriage, and the way the killer treated her showed his signature had grown even colder than the beating that ended both their lives. Patrice Harrington. Patrice Harrington had been married for less than a year when her entire future got erased in one night. 27 years old, still early enough in the marriage that everything probably still felt new, still felt like it was just getting started. Then, August 19th, 1980 happened, and none of that mattered anymore. Not the wedding, not the plans, not whatever ordinary Tuesday they thought they had ahead of them. She and Keith were found in their bedroom in their Dana Point home, both beaten to death. No forced chaos, no signs of panic, no ransacked drawers or broken glass scattered everywhere. Nothing knocked over, nothing torn apart looking for cash or jewelry, just two people who never got the chance to wake up. That controlled scene is the detail that matters most here. Sacramento had messy killings, backyard chases, dogs barking, neighbors catching glimpses, a man running through the dark half exposed. Dana Point looked nothing like that. This was quiet, this was practiced, this was a killer who walked into a house, did exactly what he came to do, and left almost nothing chaotic behind for anyone to piece together later. Prosecutor summaries confirm Patrice was sexually assaulted during the attack, fitting the same pattern seen with his other female victims before the killing began. It is the same brutal signature, just executed with more precision than before, and that precision is what should genuinely unsettle you. This was not a man getting lucky. This was a man getting better. The same expansion that took him farther from his old territory into new counties, new cities, unfamiliar layouts he'd never worked before, also came with fewer footprints, fewer fibers, fewer accidental clues left behind for anyone to find. Patrice and Keith wanted nothing more than a normal beginning, a house, a marriage, a life still being built one ordinary day at a time. Instead, they became proof that his skill set had evolved past the sloppy phase entirely, and that evolution should terrify you more than any single murder does on its own. A killer who makes mistakes eventually gets caught. A killer who stops making them does not. By now, the killer's whole method depended on ambushing couples in their sleep, waiting until two people were breathing slow and unguarded before he made his move. But his next victim wouldn't have a partner beside her at all because he'd waited for a night he knew she'd be completely alone. Manuela Whithuren. He picked the one night her husband physically could not be there, and he still tied her up like there were two people to control. That is the detail that should bother you more than the murder itself. Manuela Whithuren was 28 years old, living in a condominium in Irvine, and on February 6, 1981, her husband was stuck in a hospital bed miles away. She was alone, completely alone, and the man who broke in that night did not improvise a simpler attack to match the easier target. He brought ligatures. He brought the same binding and bludgeoning ritual he used on couples who could fight back or run for help, and he used all of it on a woman who had zero chance of resistance to begin with. That is not opportunism. That is a man following a script he had already perfected. Investigators found her bludgeoned in her own bed, raped, restrained with ligatures, matching his signature method from the original Night Stalker attacks up the coast. The condo showed signs of ransacking and small items were missing, the same souvenir taking he'd been doing since his prowler days when breaking into a house was the entire crime instead of just the opening move. He didn't need to steal from Manuela. He wanted to. So how did he know the one night to strike? Some investigators believe he tracked her husband's hospital schedule with real precision, watching the house long enough to know exactly when it would be empty of anyone but her. Others think he simply got lucky and adjusted his ritual on the fly once he realized she was solo. Either theory is unsettling, but only one of them means he was watching her long before he ever touched the door handle. Manuela wanted an ordinary recovery for her husband and an ordinary night at home. She got neither. By the time this happened, he was refining his hunting instinct hundreds of miles from where he'd first learned to kill. And then he broke his own rule completely. He went back to a place he had already hit once before. Cherry Domingo. 18 months after he murdered a surgeon and his girlfriend on Avenida Pequena, he came back to the same corner of Goleta. That is not a coincidence. That is a man testing whether the ground he'd already burned could still hold him. Law enforcement had swarmed this stretch of Goleta after the Offerman and Manning killings, canvassing houses, running patrols, treating the neighborhood like a live crime scene for months. He knew that. He came back anyway. Cherry Domingo was 35, staying temporarily at a house on Toltec Way while she sorted out her life, the kind of in-between living situation millions of people pass through without a second thought. On July 27, 1981, she was in bed with her on-again, off-again boyfriend Gregory Sanchez when someone broke into the house in the middle of the night. Both of them were found dead the next day. Domingo had been sexually assaulted, then bludgeoned. The bindings and the household items used as weapons matched a signature investigators had already logged from earlier attacks, the same controlled, premeditated staging that turned ordinary bedrooms into crime scenes with a recognizable handwriting. For years, the case sat in the same file as the others, linked by method but not by proof. DNA eventually closed that gap, tying the Domingo and Sanchez murders to the same offender behind the rest of the series. D'Angelo later admitted to it directly. The precision was never in question by this point. What's harder to explain is the nerve. This is a man who once needed total invisibility to operate, and now he's hunting blocks from a perimeter police were actively watching in the same neighborhood where they'd already found 2 bodies. That is not caution, curdling into confidence. That is confidence curdling into something closer to belief, the belief that he simply could not be caught, not here, not anywhere. Cherry wasn't alone in that house. The man beside her didn't stay bound and compliant like so many victims before him, and his refusal to go quietly through the killer's carefully scripted plan into chaos for the first time in years. Gregory Sanchez. For years, this man had a routine, and routines do not include gunshots. Every prior scene was patient, controlled, quiet enough to leave neighbors sleeping through it. This one wasn't. This one had bludgeoning wounds and bullet wounds on the same body, which means the plan broke somewhere in the middle, and he had to improvise his way through the rest. Gregory Sanchez was 27 years old, and he was there that night because he loved Cherry Domingo. Not as a stranger sharing her house, as her boyfriend staying over on July 27, 1981, in the same Goleta home where she would also die. He didn't know he'd walked into the middle of a decade-long escalation. He just knew something was wrong in his girlfriend's house, and he did the one thing almost none of the killer's victims had managed before him. He fought back. The injuries tell the story the killer never meant to leave behind. Blunt force trauma mixed with gunshot wounds is not a signature, it's a scramble. Some accounts note Sanchez wasn't found fully bound like the victims before him, which means he may have broken loose or never let the ropes finish the job in the first place. A man built his entire method on control, on tying people down before they could think straight, and here, that method visibly failed in real time. Nothing in the case files spells out exactly how much damage that struggle did to the killer's confidence, but follow the pattern. This was one of his last known attacks in the area, and a man who valued precision above everything doesn't usually walk away from a fight he barely won. DNA and pattern analysis later locked Sanchez's murder into the same series as Domingo's, one more file added to the original Night Stalker column. But this file reads different from the others. This one has a man who didn't just die, he made the killer work for it. After that night, the man who had never once hesitated went quiet. No confirmed kills for 5 straight years. And when he finally came back, it wasn't for revenge, and it wasn't for control. It was for one last victim, younger than anyone he'd touched before he disappeared completely. Janelle Cruz, 18 years old, home alone for one night in Irvine, and somehow, after 5 years of silence, that was enough to bring him back. Janelle Lisa Cruz was just starting her life when it ended on the night of May 4th into May 5th, 1986. She was staying in her family's house alone, an ordinary night millions of 18-year-olds have without a second thought. He got in anyway. She was raped and murdered with severe blunt force trauma to the head, the house left ransacked, the same signature of sexual violence and theft that had defined this killer from the start. Zero warning, zero pattern to explain the timing. 5 years earlier, this man had murdered couples with the calculated rhythm of someone perfecting a craft, and then he simply stopped. No bodies, no break-ins matching his profile. Investigators have argued for decades over those missing years, whether he kept offending unnoticed, whether age or family or fear caught up to him, whether Janelle was a random unlocked door, or something more deliberate. Nothing in the confirmed record answers that outright, but the pattern he'd shown for years points one direction. This wasn't a man losing his nerve. It was a man who had already gotten everything killing could give him. Every death before Janelle built towards something. The father who died protecting his daughter. The newlyweds barely a year into their marriage. Each murder taught him, one night at a time, that he could take a life as easily as a television. Janelle Cruz was the top of that ladder, the youngest victim, the most brutal attack. Then, permanently, nothing. D'Angelo was charged with her murder in Orange County, and in 2020 he admitted to it himself, closing a case that had haunted California for over 4 decades. He wasn't caught that night in 1986. He walked away on his own terms and stayed free for another 34 years. That silence was never mercy, and it was never exhaustion. It was a man circling back to prove one last time that he still could. He didn't end the killing because he ran out of victims. He ended it because he'd finally run out of ceiling. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.